Hello, everybody. I'm Spencer Mazyck, and this is the Bloomberg Law Podcast, a series of interviews focusing on trends in the busy legal profession. From Google to Citigroup, this has been a summer of security breaches, all stemming from the attacks of malicious hackers. Here to discuss this global pandemic and the legal responses to hacking is Derek Bambauer, a Brooklyn Law School professor who teaches internet law and intellectual property. Welcome, Professor Bambauer. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Spencer.
Okay, so I think it's fair to say that we all know what hacking is, and we know that it's been around for quite some time. But tell us, why do people hack? Is it still a prank done just for fun?
There are a lot of different motivations for hackers, and it's one of the difficulties of using one term to cover so many different motivations. There are people who hack simply for the joy of taking apart computer security systems and seeing how they work. There are people who hack for money. So those who broke into Citigroup, for example, who withdrew funds from their customers' bank accounts. There are increasingly groups who hack for patriotic reasons. So there are Chinese hackers and the Syrian Electronic Army who are doing so because of either overt links to their governments or because they feel patriotic. And there are some who hack for ideological reasons. And then there are some who simply seem to hack for fun, that they do it simply because the challenge is out there.
Yeah, and speaking of the for fun or for bragging rights, I read a report last week about something called swatting, which is when somebody hacks into your phone line or your internet line, dials 911, and then says that they're holding people hostage at your location. And so they do this, and then of course a SWAT team shows up at some unsuspecting family's home, but they do this for bragging rights, like you said, they do it for fun. And we've talked about the reasons why people hack, but tell us, who are the hackers? I mean, have the hackers changed over time?
Hackers used to be people with elite technical knowledge. They were people who could actually work with complex computers, who could program in assembly or the other difficult programming languages. And so in some senses, the barrier to entry was very high. It was like having a black belt in karate. By the time that you had those skills, you had probably learned how to be responsible using them. But the internet changed everything. So the internet not only diffuses information, it diffuses tools. And so one of the reasons for the explosion in hacking is that now there are essentially prepackaged kits that you can use, the so-called script kiddies. Where
so there's really a kit where you can use to learn how to hack into something?
There are, in fact, commercial products that you can buy that do this.
And that's legal?
It's semi-legal.
Okay.
So having the tool, as always, you know, it's legal to own a gun. What varies in terms of legality is how you use it. And so this is actually something that makes life difficult for computer security professionals, is that they not only have to face really elite hackers, who probably will be able to get in if they want to, but this sort of low-level annoyance from dealing with essentially teenagers who are downloading these tools.
And so are people hacking then in groups, though? I heard some group called Anonymous. I mean, are you familiar with that group? What exactly is it?
Anonymous and some of the other groups like lulzsec really grow out of a movement called anti-sec that takes a particular set of views about the security community, about the right way to do security research, and that has interestingly become increasingly politicized. A benign view of them is that they're some sort of online civil disobedience movement. Other people call them hacktivists.
Yeah, that's what I said, hacktivists. I heard that term. I kind of like it. It has a nice ring to it.
It's great, and it captures a lot, which is that these are not attacks that are typically done for profit. They're not done for patriotism. They're done because often Anonymous is offended by something. So they've taken up defending the WikiLeaks site, for example, or they attacked Sony because Sony's security was so notoriously poor.
And I also heard that some members of that group are threatening to kill Facebook on November 5th, so we'll see whether or not that comes to pass. But
Google might love it, right? Google Plus will take off if that happens.
Well, so we have groups, individuals who are hacking. We also have groups who are hacking. Thanks to News Corp, we also know that companies and corporations are hacking too. But so are governments and nations getting in on the hacking action?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's interesting for both policy reasons and, frankly, to legal professionals is the idea of cyber war and cyber espionage. And so we've seen everything from massive intellectual property theft, for example, from U.S. defense contractors, that appears to be able to be traced back to China. And then also on the other side, we have the Stuxnet worm, which appears to have been generated by the United States and Israel as a way of attacking Iran's nuclear centrifuge program. And so we have, it's arguably the first cyber weapon ever used. And the thinking seems to be that it did as much damage as an airstrike could have, but without the casualties. So this is something where most major military powers are increasingly viewing cyberspace as another dimension of the battlefield.
Wow, and I understand also that Lockheed Martin was recently subject to an attack. They're, of course, the supplier of military equipment to the U.S.
Absolutely. And so this is something that's of real concern to the Department of Defense, for example. They just released their cyberspace strategy. And one of their worries is that it used to be that you just had to defend military bases or military assets. And it turns out that in cyberwar, private companies are assets, right? So we saw the loss of, for example, data about the Joint Strike Fighter. That's something that affects the military, it affects our national security, but it's held by a private company.
Okay, so people are hacking with malicious intent and wanting to get profit there. So is there such a thing as a good hacker? Do people actually hack for good?
I think that there are a lot of good hackers. The difficulty is that so much of that depends on where you sit. If you're Citibank or you're a company who is hacked by somebody who doesn't have malicious intentions but just wants to show essentially that you've left the door unlocked, you might not regard that person as sort of somebody who's benevolent. But the security community tries to draw these distinctions between the bad guys, black hats, the good guys, white hats, and the people you can't really tell whose side they're on, the gray hats. It's actually lifted from Westerns, the sort of classic Hollywood movies. And the white hats are an interesting group because they're freelance security researchers, or maybe they work for a company like VeriSign. And what they do, either independently or because they have a contract with a company, is to essentially test how easy it is to break in.
Oh, that's great, but I think that's a great idea, don't you? To have somebody testing to see whether or not your system is safe or not, or secure enough, or that you're even protecting sensitive information.
Absolutely. It's really necessary, and I think these days it's almost part of corporate due diligence to ensure that your valuable assets, your proprietary information and so forth, is secure. And there's a little bit of an ostrich-like tendency with security sometimes that you just don't want to see the problems that are there. But the difficulty, of course, is that that means that the black hats are probably using them against you.
Yeah, that is true. Well, and speaking of the black hats, we talked about, and I mentioned in the intro that this was a summer chock full of hacking. So what are some other recent examples?
So we saw the hack of the website of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange.
Yeah, I read that 3 days in a row. Is that true?
It seems to be that they were actually able to take down part of the website. And that's, when I first read this, I wasn't quite as worried about it because websites are sort of like posters. The ability to tear down a poster isn't that profound. But it had an effect, which is that they were trying to release, for example, earnings information. Yeah. And so it really affected their ability to do business. So sometimes even things that are really small or simple hacks can make a real difference.
And IMF actually was another one. I think that they disclosed in June that they suffered an attack, but it actually occurred much earlier than that, even before the May 14th date of Strauss-Kahn being arrested on that date. But I read with IMF that the attack that they used was something called spearfishing. What exactly is that?
We've all probably received a phishing email. It's something that looks dodgy and says, oh, you need to reset your password, or your email account is over its quota. And it turns out it's not from your organization at all. It's from somebody in an Eastern European country. Spearfishing is the much more clever version of this. If phishing is a net, spearfishing is exactly as it implies. It's a laser-like attack. And what it's intended to do is to use the weakest point of any security system against it, which is the people. And so it's something that you or I might open an email that's actually from a hacker, and we'd believe it because it says something like benefits change, or it looks like it comes from our manager. And then when you open the document that's attached to it, it exploits a vulnerability on your computer or in an application, and the attacker can then use it to comb through your company's networks for data.
Well, I mean, and speaking of getting the phishing emails, I think I received something that looked like it came from UPS that actually said that I had packages waiting for me, and in order to find out what the packages are and where they were located, I needed to click on an attachment, which of course I did not do, but was that an attempt to hack into my computer?
Almost certainly, and the question is whether this is sort of generalized trolling, trying to find somebody who will actually open up the email, or whether they were targeting you. And UPS is a good one. And I used to feel badly, or sort of, wonder if I was sort of peculiarly subject to this, but no, it turns out that FBI Director Robert Mueller almost entered all of his banking information into a phishing site that looked like Bank of America.
Wow, that's amazing.
He was about to click the button and his wife made him stop. So,
thank God for his wife. That's incredible. I can't believe that.
If they can get the FBI director, what hope do the rest of us have?
Yeah, exactly. Well, what about, I think people who hack for fun, though, they think that this is all fun and games, but isn't it causing some serious damages to companies?
It has the potential to. And the difficulty is that so many of the things that companies rely on now are virtual. So it's not things that you produce or things that you have, it's information that you possess. And oftentimes that information is valuable simply because other people don't know it.
Well, and I read something about like the average organizational cost in the U.S. for a data breach in 2010 was about $7.2 million, which is just kind of insane to me. But is there a way, though, to prosecute the people who are hacking? Does the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, is that the primary federal statute to go after prosecuting hackers?
It's one of them. And so the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is all about people who are doing something they're not authorized to do on your computer system or your computer network. Increasingly, Congress has tried to give prosecutors additional tools. So there has been, for example, criminal penalties for violation of intellectual property laws, for example, anti-wiretapping laws. And increasingly, clever prosecutors are also turning to state law, which is the sort of thing that most lawyers tend to ignore in these situations. Just as
But why is that, though? Why do lawyers just ignore it, the state law, generally?
I think because we think of the internet as something that crosses borders. And when we deal with that, we're used to thinking of the federal government.
Got it.
But it turns out that states have been even more worried. And so some of their laws are broader and hence more helpful to prosecutors, even than things like the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act.
Well, what kind of penalties are out there for hackers?
They can be significant. So something that's felony hacking can be punishable by up to 10 years in jail. And often what prosecutors will do is they'll attempt to make multiple charges stick. And so what they'll do is what's called charge stacking. So they'll be able to get multiple penalties for essentially the same act.
What I want to know about, though, is international hackers. What about the folks who are hacking from international waters? Are we able to go after them and prosecute them either through the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act or any other federal legislation?
In theory, we have the ability to go after people via federal legislation, and there's also something called the Convention on Cybercrime, which the U.S. has acceded to. They're a member of the Convention on Cybercrime. The difficulty is that it's very hard to pursue people across borders, just as in sort of the classic physical world. It takes time and money. You have to get the cooperation of other governments. And there are some governments who are actually willing to shelter hackers, either because the hackers are essentially acting with their interests in mind, or simply just because sometimes it's good business.
Yeah, and some people say with Google's recent attack, they suspect that maybe China, the Chinese government, might be behind it, partly because of who they were targeting with that. I think that they wanted to get, the Gmail usernames and passwords from senior U.S. government officials, Chinese political activists, officials in several Asian countries, military personnel, and journalists. But I wonder, though, if we were even able to identify who those Chinese, the people who were in China actually hacking, whether or not we'd be able to prosecute them because the U.S. doesn't have an extradition treaty with China.
It would, practically speaking, be very difficult. What makes this even harder is that it's not clear that these particular hackers were working for the Chinese government, but their interests are almost certainly aligned with the Chinese government, and China encourages this sort of patriotic hacking movements. And this is the whole difficulty with hacking internationally, is that Google was able to trace these attacks back to China, to a province in China, but the trail ends there. So you know where it comes from, but you don't know who it is.
Well, and I want to turn now and talk to protecting sensitive information, because I think part of it is if the companies do their responsibilities in protecting information, then it makes it less difficult to hack. But with that, I'd like to talk about Sony. You mentioned it earlier, and with reference to Anonymous, and like you said, part of the reason why that group went after Sony again for a second time in June was because they wanted to expose and reveal the fact that their sensitive information was still unencrypted. So is there kind of a universal standard for protecting sensitive information?
There isn't yet, and this is one of the difficulties, is that it depends on which industry a company is in, and really whether or not there is any governing statute, for example, sort of like HIPAA in the healthcare world, or the PCI DSS private standard for the payment card industry. But other than that, it's sort of this vague mixture of best practices, maybe a little bit of tort law, a little bit of technology thrown in. And so, for example, we see that even though it's relatively cheap to encrypt information, to make sure that if somebody loses a laptop, a hacker can't just read the data right off the disk, it still is the exception and not the rule.
And even on a state level then, I mean, there's sort of like this patchwork of regulation, I imagine. But that might make it confusing for companies, though, to comply with any particular law, does it not?
It's very difficult for companies, and this is one of the reasons that we've seen a push, even by affected companies, for example, for national data breach notification, because right now they have this patchwork of state-level data breach notification laws, and it's very difficult if you're a national company to comply with all of them. It gets very costly. And so, as strange as it is, you see companies actually calling for federal legislation in this area.
Yeah, it's interesting. And also, I guess the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, kind of governs this area, and they have put out a set of guidelines and what companies can use to aid in protecting sensitive information. So what do they recommend?
Right now, the FTC is very focused on questions around privacy, and their thinking is one of minimization. If companies aren't storing more information than they need, if they're not keeping it longer than they have to use it for a business purpose, then it minimizes the amount of damage that occurs with a breach. And that's a really sort of sharp move, because it's like disasters or bad weather. Breaches are inevitable, and so companies do much better to think about mitigation rather than prevention in some ways.
You know, I really get the sense that regulators here are kind of playing a game of catch-up when it comes to the realm of cybersecurity. Do you agree with that? Is that a fair statement?
Absolutely. And it's been a complaint about the law. The law is slow to evolve. We've had this
in every area.
And so it's why it's really important in some ways to not just depend on regulation by law, but also to look to industry best practices, brand reputation, for companies to see that better security practices are actually in their own business interest as well as in the interest of their customers.
All right, well, we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you very much, Spencer.
When we come back, our spotlight on contributed content. We'll be back in a moment.
Digital technology has transformed the way we live our lives. We can access any piece of information at any time from anywhere. We can share ideas with thousands of people instantly. Staying up to date with breaking news and events is easier now than ever before. All this lets us keep pace with the world in real time. Yet, have any of these innovations been applied to the way we research and practice law? Starting today, the answer is yes. Welcome to Bloomberg Law, the first and only real-time research system for the 21st century legal practice, created by the leading provider of data and information services. A single search feature with access to legal, news, and company databases provides you with powerful legal research results and a holistic view of your clients, filtered so you know the information you receive will be relevant every time. Customizable legal, financial, and news alerts keep you ahead of your clients and in tune with their world. An integrated workspace allows you to organize your results by client, by urgency, by topic, however you want it, and to share those results with people on your team. Log in now to experience Bloomberg Law.
Now it's time for our Spotlight on Contributed Content. This is a segment where we highlight an article that was featured in one of our Bloomberg Law reports. Today's article comes to us from Tim St. Clair of Turner Pageant. The title of the article is Minding the Store, Addressing IP Theft in the Workplace. As technology has advanced, the majority of corporate assets are now intangible intellectual property, and mechanical safeguarding has become somewhat ineffective. This article offers some basic steps to protect your patents, copyrights, trademarks, and trade secrets from corporate theft. You can find it in the August 8th issue of our Bloomberg Law Reports, Intellectual Property Law on the Terminal and IPLR Go, or at bloomberglaw.com. Articles are contributed to us for publication by practitioners, law professors, and other legal experts. To find out more about how you can contribute, please visit our bloomberglaw.com. A special thank you to Tim St. Clair for that contributed piece. And again, our thanks to Professor Derek Bambauer of Brooklyn Law School. Bye, everybody. All right.